Hi, I'm Brad Newcombe, and you're watching Pressure Point. None of us lives in a vacuum, but we live in a world of government and politics, work and family and relationships. And in the same way, as Christian ethics, we have to make decisions in this same world. So what are the ethics that we live by, and how do we come to our ethical choices? Well, with me to talk about understanding ethics is the Reverend Dr. Terry Anderson, Professor Emeritus of Christian Social Ethics at Vancouver School of Theology. So welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Brad. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I'd like to start off with, in understanding ethics, when we say the word ethics, what does that mean?
What on earth do we mean?
Yeah, what do we mean by ethics?
Yes. Well, I suppose you could say that ethics is concerned with thinking carefully, systematically, carefully, about the kinds of persons we should seek to become, and the sorts of things we should do or not do that are good, bad, fitting. Yeah. And it's kind of thinking about what sorts of things go into answering moral decisions and so on. And what we use the word interchangeably, we often say an ethical decision, or is this the ethical thing to do? But ethics is really a little more one step back from that, saying what should go into answering those questions.
Okay, because that's the other thing. You mentioned they're moral, and you mentioned ethical, and I've always been confused. Are they the same? Do they mean the very same thing, or are they different? Like, and if I have ethics, is that the same as having morals, or?
Well, I think in our ordinary day language we use them interchangeably.
Right.
But in a more technical sense, people make a distinction that's sometimes useful between morality, which is behavior according to custom or code.
Right.
You know what's cricket, or you know what's the right thing to do or not thing to do. And morals, which is thinking about more intentionally about what should one do, and what kind of person should one be, and what is the right and the good. And ethics, which thinks about what goes into answering those questions.
Right.
And where do we turn to find the answers, and why bother being good at all?
So, and the other thing I was wondering about is, do we all have an ethics? Like, does every group and every culture have an ethical, like, is ethics a particular standard? Like, is it always sort of the best? Or could we say that the mafia, for instance, have their own set of ethics?
Mm-hmm. Yes. See, I think every group and subgroup and every person has lives by a morality or a moral code. Right. And therefore we would commonly say by an ethic.
Right.
They may not have thought through that, which is what ethics more technically is concerned with.
Right.
Why do they have that? Where does it come from?
Right.
Yeah.
So then, in other words, when you're studying ethics, then you're really being very intentional in terms of trying to understand why you do what you do, or why you want to do this and do it better or be a better person, and then also where that comes from.
Yes.
Right? Like, that's the other thing, is that, and that's one of the things I want to talk about, understanding ethics, is where do we get these guiding principles, and what are they, and what are they based on? You know.
Well, I think that's why we hear so much more about it these days, is because see, in stable, homogeneous cultures that are pretty much the same and have remained the same, everybody grows up or socialized into a certain ethic or morality. They know what they should do. They may not always do it, of course. The problem is doing it. Yeah. But they know what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and the kinds of persons that we should seek to become. But when things are in rapid change, and new technologies and science comes along, presents new problems for which there's no traditional answer, and when we're living in a dynamic culture and a global society where there are many different ethics or moralities, or then people have to sort out and ask the question, well then, where do I turn? How do I decide between these? What is the right thing to do? And that's ethics more properly considered.
And then I see that every day in the paper, whether it's the Prime Minister involved with some sort of ethics counselor and commission and so on, or whether it's a baby waiting for a liver transplant and having to go to the United States because there they allow non-relatives to donate organs or parts of organs. In Canada, we don't.
or businesses dealing in other cultures and societies that have a different ethic and a different way of behaving, etc.
So, and it's big business right now, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, there's a boom in ethics at the moment.
So
I think for those reasons.
Okay. Now, then that means there's a couple of sort of general questions I want to ask about ethics. One is the difference between absolute and situational ethics. In other words, and let's just take the example of telling a lie. You could say you never tell a lie, and we've all heard that. You know, I think George Washington never told a lie or something like that, that little myth. On the other hand, are there situations where it's better, sometimes a situational ethic, where it might be actually more loving or kinder or the better for the common good to tell a lie? Can you explain the difference between?
Well, different ethics or moralities would have different answers to that question.
Okay.
But let me try one as an illustration.
Okay.
I would make a distinction between absolute principles, or principles are kind of broad directives, like you shouldn't lie.
Right.
And I would say that that's an absolute principle. One should always tell the truth.
Right.
One should always seek the well-being of others.
Right.
Between those sorts of absolutes and how you apply them.
Right.
Now, where the situational part comes in is how do you apply them, particularly when two conflict.
Right.
Supposing I'm trying to seek somebody's well-being, but if I tell the truth I will harm them, then what do? I have two absolute principles.
Right, and they're in conflict with each other.
Right, and so therefore in that situation you have to take priority of one over the other, and that's where the situational part comes in. But other people say there are no absolute principles.
Oh, okay.
And still other people say, well, but there's some actions that are always wrong, regardless of what principles conflict, and I would give as an example, I think it's always wrong to rape.
Right.
Don't tell me some situations, maybe you have to do that. Right. No, I'd say it's always wrong to rape.
Right.
Does that?
Yeah, I understand, yes.
So it's a mix. It's hard to answer that simply.
But now, say for to kill,
yes.
Some would say it's always wrong to kill a life, to take a life. And I know that, just to give an example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in the 20th century, in World War II, very well-known German theologian, pastor, went through that agonizing choice of saying, not believing that one should kill, and then being part of a plot to assassinate Hitler.
Yes, yes.
And so he obviously had to wrestle with that in that context, at that point in time, that no longer became a guiding principle, did it? I mean, or it did, but...
Well, it did, you see, in the sense that I think what Bonhoeffer would say is that he chose the lesser of evils.
Right, okay.
And so, therefore, what he would do, he wouldn't say was right, but the lesser of all the alternatives were bad, because they all violated some absolute principle.
Right.
And in this situation, he chose to violate that one. But it's so important to have these absolute principles because they push us to call what we do by the right name.
Right.
Instead of saying, oh, this is good, I can do it with an easy conscience. You say, no, this is wrong, but all the other alternatives were even worse. And you work hard, therefore, to see that you try to prevent those kind of situations happening again.
It takes a lot of living in the moment, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
It really does.
It does.
It takes a fair bit of attention and attentiveness, doesn't it, too? What about discern? Like, how do we discern? I mean, it seems to me discernment would be a word that would come up there. And you, as an ethicist, how do you help people to discern these directions?
Well, I think that has partly to do with the other question. We've been focusing on what should people do, and how do you know what you should do in difficult circumstances? Moral dilemmas, we would call them.
Yeah.
There's also the question of what kind of person should we seek to become.
Right.
And one of the things that helps us discern is cultivating habits of the heart, fundamental dispositions, being the right sort of person so that we have better eyes to see and ears to hear. In fact, there's a classic virtue. Those are habits of the heart that we call good. Vices are habits of the heart we call bad.
Right.
But there's a classic virtue called prudence, which is developing the art of discerning in difficult situations. How do you weigh those principles, and what should you do? And how do you cultivate a kind, a generous, a loving disposition so you're better able to weigh them? Right. So that's not the whole answer, but that's part of it.
Part of it, yeah. So then it seems to me that I want to get back to the foundation for this ethical decision making and the ethics that we have. And we live in a world with many different cultures and religions and so on, and I introduced you as Professor Emeritus of Christian Social Ethics. So I want to talk a little bit about Christian ethics as opposed to general ethics. Like, what are the differences?
Yeah. Well, if we were saying that ethics is concerned with thinking carefully about what kinds of considerations should and do go into the sorts of persons we should become and what we should do, Christian ethics is trying to think in light of a commitment to the God in Jesus Christ.
Right.
In light of that commitment and the beliefs that are related to that, what sorts of considerations should go into answering those questions? So they might be a different sort of consideration or different weighing of them because of our commitment to God. And Christian ethics is thinking that through. And a good definition of Christian ethics is saying, how do we think about the question and answer the question, what is God requiring and enabling us to be sorts of persons and to do right action, behavior.
So now I can see where you could have Christian ethics, I can see where I could have Jewish ethics, Muslim ethics, and so on. General ethics, what are the foundations there? I mean, when there's an ethics board or something in a hospital, or the Prime Minister has an ethics counselor and so on, like what are the foundations there?
Well, people are asking that question, particularly with the Prime Minister saying this. But there has been in Western society for many years the notion that we can discover that foundation for ethics by thinking rationally and clearly, that all reasonable people, if they think carefully about it, can discern what is the right, the good, the fitting, and what should go into answering that. But in recent years, people are discovering what a cultural bias that was, that actually what people thought was a universal reason actually is very much Western and influenced by Jewish and Christian and Greek thought, and is not so universal at all, and is much more particular. So people are now having to ask, how do we converse together and talk about these differences to see if we can arrive at some commonalities? An example would be human rights. Human rights is an effort to try to find from all these different ethics and cultures, are there some things we universally agree upon rather than saying there's some universal system in place? And so in healthcare ethics, for example, we've hammered out over the past 25, 30 years, I've been involved in this, some kind of basic principles like one shouldn't harm, one should seek the well-being of others, one should respect the free choices of others, one should distribute resources equally and fairly, justice. That these kind of basic principles almost everybody agrees on, but how they're applied in a situation, or how they're interpreted, the meaning of them, will differ. And so a lot of what happens in hospital ethics committees is negotiating and comparing and sorting out those differences.
And we're in a very complex time, aren't we?
Yes,
I mean,
we are.
We're facing life and death issues because the technology has run so quickly, so that and the value of keeping life at all costs, sometimes at the expense of a quality of life.
Yes, exactly.
And then there are people who are saying enough is enough. They say my value is I would rather die. Or I would rather have my loved one die. Or the other thing about, I mean, the free reign of science. I mean, that it's not in a vacuum, that the scientific discoveries and applications have implications for all of us.
So when we're faced with a question, for example, should one withhold or withdraw treatment from a patient who's not able to make their own decision, and you know that patient comes from a different culture or religion than those of the health caregivers, who decides, and how do we enter into their worldview and their beliefs and their ethics to know what considerations should go into answering that? And supposing it goes against our own conscience, our own feeling of what is the right thing to do as a health caregiver, what then? And how do we work that out? That's why we have these ethicists and ethics committees to try to work those things through.
I know you've spent a fair bit of time working with First Nations people and cultures and so on. Can you say a little bit about your experience with First Nations people and how that has influenced your work in ethics?
Well, it's been marvelous. experience for me and a great privilege, because one of the things that it's helped me do is see how in my own tradition, in the Christian faith and the Bible, my whole understanding of human beings, the sorts of persons we are, the kinds of things we're called to be, Native people have helped me rediscover the roots of that in Scripture, because they believe so strongly that we're primarily persons of relationship, meant for relationships. They would say kinfolk, all related and bound together. And that shapes, therefore, how I interpret the well-being for others that I should seek. And it's very different from Western culture, which says we're primarily individuals.
Right.
And the great emphasis is on I should be able to do what I want, be free to do it, rather than I should do in things that will strengthen the web of relationships and the harmony of relationships. And so Native people have helped me rediscover my own Christian tradition and roots in that, and challenge my own culture.
So that in a sense that we within the Christian tradition also have that sense of kinship and,
yes.
and oneness, but over the centuries or years
it's become highly individualistic, we
right.
would say, in our society.
Which seems to me then, that seems to me in terms of ethics becomes one of the tension areas, because we live, as you say, in a very individualistic culture
right.
and time and
right.
era,
yeah.
and there are other cultures around the world that are much more collective and communal.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
and similarly in relation to creation, see?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that they see the
We're
whole
also
link.
related and connected to creation, and therefore much of their First Nations ethic, it would vary with different First Nations, but would see a key guidance for us is what respects and creates harmony with that, and preserves that harmony with the created order. And that's very biblical too. But we've become so individualistic, we put a different emphasis. And,
so we as sort of the Western, sort of European kind of background, have a kind of over and above it all somehow,
right,
or
right.
Distinct from it. So is that a tension for us in making decisions? Like, first of all, we're blinded by our own perspective
mm-hmm.
often.
Mm-hmm.
So we have, but the individual versus the communal, is that
yes.
one of the tension areas?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Can you have some examples as to how that gets played out?
At many different points. Well, I think it has to do, as I say, with how we understand well-being. Do you understand well-being primarily as what's good for me or what's good for this person? Or do you understand well-being in terms of how do you create right relationships? Mm-hmm. What sort of actions, what kind of person do I seek to become to create right relationships rather than to promote my own identity mm-hmm. and my own agenda? Mm-hmm. And that takes one in quite different directions. For example, if on the question of withholding treatment or of a dying patient, Native people will ask the question, should we treat this person even though they're dying? Should we try to keep them alive or not until they've had a chance to be reconciled with their family and say goodbye to their family and sort out right relationships and so forth and so on. Yeah. And that tilts you in a different direction.
Of course.
Than if you say, I just don't want to be bothered with this anymore.
Right. And you mentioned for First Nations, for instance, would see one of the relational components would be creation mm-hmm. and nature and the world around us. Makes me think of environmental ethics. Is mm-hmm. that a growing area, or is that? Oh my goodness, yes. Say a little bit about yes. What's happening with environmental ethics.
Well, a great deal. I mean, one might make a distinction between the change of our basic beliefs about how we understand creation and the role of human beings in it. That's one whole area. But as people begin to rethink that, like, for example, we were talking about more in the direction of Native people, then it raises the question of how do we live that out? What do we do when it conflicts or seems to conflict with the well-being of workers, for instance?
Right. So that, in other words, people need a paycheck and they
yes,
need to,
Yes. And so in BC, for instance, where that tension often arises, we don't ask a very important ethical question, I don't think, namely, we don't bring to bear a very important ethical principle from Christian point of view of justice. And we need to ask, all right, if we need to change our relationship to the environment and therefore cease doing certain things, how do we share the burdens of that fairly? Not only the rewards of it, but the burdens of it.
Right.
So from a Christian perspective, we would say we shouldn't just foist all the burdens of that on loggers, for instance, or small logging companies, but how do we bear equally and fairly the burdens of having to restore our relationship with creation.
So that
sorting that out is quite complex.
I was going to say, because that's socially, I mean, that would be, there's a huge social component to that.
Is. Yep.
The other thing is there's also a personal cost.
Yep. Exactly.
Because, I mean, in other words, if I have to share that, that means that does a percentage of my paycheck have to go to supplement the people who've lost their livelihood.
Yeah. Otherwise, we're asking a certain group of the population to bear all the cost of my values.
Right. In other words, and it's easy for me to be green and stuff if it's not going to cost me a cent.
Exactly.
But as soon as it starts to hit me, then, well, maybe I'm not so maybe I'm not so sure that this is so important.
So how do we share those burdens more equitably? I think it's important issue.
You mentioned justice. What about the love? Is there a love principle in all of this? I mean, and I think of the golden rule, you know, to love your neighbor as yourself.
Well, let's think of it more for a moment from a Christian perspective. I think there's one thing we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, but I want to talk about the foundation of Christian ethics.
Okay, do that.
And the foundation of Christian ethics is very much, it's what I call a because of ethic rather than an order to ethic.
Okay.
It's because of what God's freely done for us, because that God loves us and accepts us however imperfect we are, or whatever wrong we do. God accepts us and enters into a new relationship with us and longs for abundance and a new relationship with us. Because of that, when we catch a glimpse of that, then therefore we try to seek to be a neighbor to others and to love them as God loves us.
Okay.
That's very different than saying, I must do certain things in order to get into heaven.
Right.
In order to win God's favor. That makes ethics and right doing and being a kind of sweaty, anxious, and leads to self-righteousness and pride, whereas the other is done out of gratitude and a joyous sort of thing, and saying, gee, God's been so wonderful to me and created such a wonderful world and has given me a glimpse of his love for me through other people and their care. Now, how do I show that forth in my love for neighbor and be unto them as generous and as kind, and seek justice and harmony?
And I mean, it's, as you say, a grateful heart. I mean,
yes.
it's like the difference between talking to someone with a grateful heart as opposed to a fearful heart.
Yes, exactly.
Because the other, in order to gain something, you're always worried about whether you've done the right or the wrong thing.
And you're preoccupied with showing everybody else that you alone have the right way and you are right, rather than being able to say, I think this is right, or this, I'm trying to be faithful to God, but thank God, finally I'm acceptable to God, whether I get it right perfectly or not.
Mm-hmm.
Frees us to admit we may be wrong.
Right, and that's very important, because we will be.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
exactly.
one of the
given all the complexities we talked about.
Of course. I mean, at least I'd rather err on the side that, you know, I think I'll be wrong, as opposed to I'm sure I'm going to be right. Yeah. Now, we only have about 5 minutes left, so I want you to highlight some of how you see the foundations of the foundation of Christian ethics. I mean, just
well, I think the key thing for me
that
it's grounded in what we would call God's grace, God's free gift of love, and we're responding in grace. We're responding in thanksgiving, I should say, to that grace.
Right.
Then I think we say now, how then do we learn what God's requiring and enabling us? Because God empowers us as well as requires us. That's another form of grace. How do I discover what that is? And as Christians of almost all stripes would say, well, we turn to where we think God has disclosed himself, or God's self most clearly. And that is in places like Scripture, the Bible, and in the experience and teachings of Christians across the ages, of all different cultures, all different eras. They face these problems. What do we learn from them?
That's right. I mean, I do remember hearing somebody say that. I think it was Doug Hall, one of our professors, and said, you know, there's been a conversation going on for 2,000 plus years.
About how you love your neighbor.
It's presumptuous to jump in right now without having listened to any of that beforehand.
And how you love your neighbor.
Yeah.
I remember being in a dialogue with an Orthodox, a Greek Orthodox, who said, and we were trying to struggle what to do in some social issue, and he said, well, our church tried that between 450 and 500 AD, and it didn't work. And we discovered that wasn't the way of God. Right. And so we can learn from mistakes as well as advantage. So that's another source. And a third is the kind of experience of Christians around the globe in the present. It's very helpful to know how do we discern what to do, what can we learn from native Christians, for example, about how they relate to the environment, from their experience, What do we learn about justice from people who are suffering from injustice in Latin America or in Africa?
South Africa,
Yeah,
certainly.
yeah,
Lots to learn there.
exactly.
And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, too. I mean, in terms of that, I mean, the amnesty given after, you know, and so on.
And what can we learn from people's sort of immediate experience of God in prayer, a luminous experience? So those are some of the sources in which we draw upon to try to see if we can get some broad directions, like go north rather than south.
Right.
Some more, some dispositions and habits of the heart, so we can see more clearly what's going on around us,
Right.
so that we can interpret that rightly, what's in accord with the general direction
Right.
God's leading humankind. That we might even get some more specific directives as whereabouts in Prince George do we go if we go north?
Right, of course, yes.
And so on. But those are more situational bound, the more
Right.
specific ones.
But and we live with them all, don't we? I mean,
Yeah.
there's the broader, more general ones, and then we also make these decisions in our day-to-day lives.
Exactly.
I mean, and we make them in our own human relationships,
Yeah.
our families and
Yeah.
our loved ones
Yeah.
and our colleagues
Yeah.
and so on. But one of the things I like about what you're doing is that it doesn't feel it doesn't feel so much right and wrong. It feels like, you know, general directions and trends and paths, but I still feel a freedom to be able to explore those possibilities,
Yes,
you know?
within certain parameters.
Right.
Like we said, there were some absolute wrongs.
Right,
I
okay,
said.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So you can't say everything's gray.
No,
No,
so
you didn't mean that.
Didn't
No,
mean it quite that
no,
way.
no.
Although as I was saying it, I realized it was coming across like, oh well, I mean, we'll just sort of find
Yeah.
our way.
Yeah, so you like killing people. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Right.
No, we don't want to do that.
No. I guess, Brad, what I would covet more in our churches, but also in our communities, is places where people can take counsel together about these matters and say, what is God requiring, enabling us to do in our time and in this situation?
And to be able to talk about it.
And how can we learn from those sources?
Out of time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Good.
Talking with Terry Anderson about understanding ethics. Thanks for joining us on Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe.